Okay. Namaskar. We are delighted to inform Symbiosis Law School Noida, in association with Lex Witness, India's first magazine on legal and corporate affairs, THS the law firm, Sadgamaya, presents knowledge series on law and justice. Today we are witnessing the Leaf 5 and session number 10 as part of the series. Today's session is titled Criminal Investigation and Trial, and the resource person for the day is Mr. Anupam Lal Das, Senior Advocate, Supreme Court of India. I would like to inform the august gathering that the relationship which Symbiosis Law School Noida has with Mr. Anupam Lal Das is more than a professional relation, because he is the one who has been associated with the law school since its inception, rather was responsible for its inception. Thank you very much, Mr. Anupam Lal Das, for accepting our invitation to participate in the knowledge series on law and justice. I would request Mr. Raj Kamal to address the audience and set the rules of the housekeeping.
Thank you, sir. We are honored and privileged today to witness the webinar on the criminal investigation and trial by one of the most dashing and eminent criminal lawyers, Mr. Anupam Lal Das. Sir, on behalf of the organizers of Knowledge Series of Law and Justice, we welcome you and all the participants to the webinar. Before we begin, and I hand over the floor to you, I would just like to make the housekeeping rules for all the participants. This session will go on for an hour and a half. The participants could put their questions in the Q&A box, and we will put it to sir while he's addressing the topic. Please note that there will be a live question and answer session towards the end of the webinar, and you will have to press the raise hand icon, and we'll put you in the queue so that you can ask your live questions to sir. We will try and address as many questions as possible. Over to you, sir.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's indeed a pleasure to be a part of the knowledge series on law. Now, my topic for the day is criminal investigation and trial. So first, I would like to address everybody on the relevance of this topic and why did I choose this topic. It may sound a little cut and dry, but according to me, this topic is most relevant today. And as lawyers, we must all be abreast with criminal law, dehoards the fact that we could be specializing or practicing in any stream of law. Now, let me start my topic and let me try why this topic is most relevant today. Now, my first argument is that almost every law has a facet of criminal law. And therefore, it is important for every lawyer to know the basics of criminal law. Now, let me address the virtual world first. I call it virtual world because many of us practice in areas like cyber laws, which includes the Information Technology Act, the Copyright Act, etc. Now, the IT Act deals with varied and myriad subjects, which are also subsumed in the Indian Penal Code. For instance, the IT Act deals with data privacy and theft. It deals with child pornography. It deals with gender selection, for which we have a specialized act now called the Prenatal and Pre-Diagnostic Techniques Act 1994. Then we have issues dealing with intermediaries under the IT Act, namely platforms like or search engines like Google, Yahoo, Microsoft, etc. Now, these intermediaries have been given a safe haven because they are not responsible for the content that is being posted on the website. Then you have issues like crimes being committed under the IT Act or other allied acts, and the fact that most of these companies are outside the jurisdictional limits of sovereign India. Now, how do you make them accountable? Because the traditional concept of boundaries stand eroded, completely eroded, when you talk of the World Wide Web, etc. So these are very, very important legal issues. Suppose an intermediary does not even have a working office in India. How do you make them accountable for a crime that is committed within the territorial limits of India? And all the issues now, unlike civil law, in criminal law, the place of occurrence is where the criminal law kicks in, unlike in civil law, which is the cause of action. Now, the place of occurrence could be somebody sitting in a remote part in the US, committing an offense or indulging in something which could be a crime within our penal statute. Now let's talk about the physical world. So my first leg of the argument was that crimes committed in the virtual world are subsumed under the IPC. It may have a civil facet. It may also have a criminal facet. Now, even in the physical world, when we talk of civil laws, pure civil laws, now most of the civil laws have a criminal law facet. For instance, a landlord-tenant typical eviction matter. There could be a criminal facet where the tenant is sought to be evicted without the due process of law. The tenant would be then entitled for protection under the civil laws. Now, under the criminal law, if there is a breach of peace, section 145 could be invoked. There could be a sealing under 146. That sealing would operate till a civil court decides as to who is in possession, etc. Now, in a property matter, which is again a purely civil matter, there could be a dispute with regard to, say, destruction of property, which would again have a criminal law facet. There could be instances of fraudulent sale deeds. Now, sale deed is a pure civil matter. Now, the criminal facet is a fraudulent sale deed, which would then sections 406, breach of trust, 420, etc. would kick in. Then you have various white-collared crimes. You may have a dispute between typically two companies, which may on the face of it appear to be a pure civil or commercial dispute. It may also involve a criminal law facet with regard to the intent of cheating being there at the inception of the contract. So therefore, again, criminal becomes intrinsic to a pure commercial contract. Then you have now agencies, independent agencies like the Economic Offences Wing, which if a dispute is over 1 crore, it goes to the EOW straight away. Despite the fact that it may also have a civil angle, a commercial angle, and a criminal angle. Then you have typically matrimonial laws, a typical divorce matter, conjugal rights matters. Now 498A, 406, etc. is invoked in most of the matrimonial matters. So this is again the criminal law element. Then you have laws dealing with gender issues, laws dealing with sexual harassment at workplace, which may have a civil facet, which may also have a criminal facet. Now Vishakha, Supreme Court laid down extensive guidelines in Vishakha as to how a sexual harassment at workplace is to be dealt with. Now 7 years down the line, you have a specialized act dealing with the prevention of sexual harassment at workplace. and protection of women. So therefore, the argument insofar as civil laws are concerned and the various statutes, again, you have to know criminal law. Now let's deal with matters involving pure corporate law. You have the Companies Act 2013. Now you have a category of offenses which are offenses dealing with offenses by companies. Then you have now the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code of 2016. You have various matters dealing with avoidable transactions, dealing with fraudulent transactions under Section 66, etc., etc. And all these involve penal consequences. Again, then you have typical foreign contribution matters. For instance, an NGO may be getting funds from abroad. Now it has to register now compulsorily under the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, the FCRA. If it is not, then there are matters entailing criminal consequences. Fund which could lead to registration of FIRs on allegations of misappropriation, misutilization, and non-declaration, etc. Then you have a very, very important statute now called the Prevention of Money Laundering Act. Now, this is a very, very strong statute dealing with proceeds of crime. And you have the Enforcement Directorate, which is charged with investigating offenses under the PMLA Act. Now, this is a unique act because earlier, the earlier conventional law said that a crime must be registered through an FIR, and under the IPC, investigation used to take place, and then a charge sheet used to be filed. And post filing of charge sheet, the Enforcement Directorate used to take over to find out as to whether the proceeds are proceeds of crime or not, and then they used to file a complaint. So their complaint is akin to a charge sheet under the IPC, CRPC. Now, what they do is they just register what is called an ECIR, which is an administrative document. An accused has no right to even get a copy of that document. And criminal law sets in motion. So there are parallel investigation agencies, namely maybe an Enforcement Directorate in one hand, CBI on the other hand, or could be a local police on one hand and ED on the other hand. So an accused has to face two parallel investigations. Now, PMLA deals typically with money and proceeds of crime. So this also has a criminal law facet. So therefore, the argument that I am trying to put forth, the argument that I seek to bring home, is that every lawyer, irrespective of the branch of law that he is practicing in, must be abreast with criminal law. That's the first limb of my argument. And I hope I am convincing on this. Now, let us now come to criminal law. So now at the outset, I want to tell everybody that I do not want this webinar to be a cut and dry webinar or to be a very, very structured webinar. I would like this webinar to be interactive, and you're most welcome to pose questions, as Mr. Raj Kamal indicated, in the Q&A box, and at the end of the session, I would love to take your questions live. Now, let me introduce criminal law, the very basics of criminal law to you. Now, in the mid-19th century, criminal law as we understand today was born with Lord Thomas Babington Macaulay conceiving three acts, namely the Indian Penal Code 1860. Please note the dates, very, very important. The Evidence Act of 1872 and the CRPC, originally 1882, amended in 1898, and now we have the CRPC of 1973. Now, the reason why I'm insisting on the date is that when these laws were codified for the first time by Lord Macaulay, India was still under the British Raj. So all these laws have a colonial flavor, if I may use this expression. Now, Lord Macaulay, despite the fact that he was a Brit, was still a very, very reasonable man. And he incorporated certain safeguards in these three statutes to ensure that rules of fair play and natural justice were not given a go-by. Despite the fact that India, those days, was under the British Raj, and we were subjects of the British Raj. And the idea at that time was to ensure that the police and the administration had deep and pervasive control as far as the penal actions of individuals or citizens under the British Raj, subjects under the British Raj, was concerned. Now, I want to just very briefly analyze the mechanism provided for under the CRPC and the IPC. The offenses are listed under the IPC and the procedure is provided for under the CRPC, and then we have the rules of evidence. Now, if there is a complaint disclosing a cognizable offense, the police is bound to register it under section 154 of CRPC. Now, an FIR, a first information report, could be lodged by the police on its own motion, suo motu, or based on a complaint by the informant, which could be anybody, anyone who has knowledge of the crime. Now, the moment a first information is registered, an investigating officer is appointed who's charged with the job of conducting investigation. Now, I do not want to get into the nitty-gritties of how an investigation takes place, but be that as it may, let me very broadly indicate to you as to how an investigation takes place before taking you to the second limb of my argument, namely the fallacy in the system and how it ought to be corrected, and the yawning apathy of our lawmakers insofar as these corrective measures are concerned. So once an FIR is registered, the investigating officer is what is called a case diary. Now he has to record everything in the case diary as to how the investigation progresses. So typically the first step is that he visits the crime scene on receipt of information, or it could be the local police also. And thereafter, the first on the a RUCA is prepared, and which is sent to the jurisdictional magistrate as quickly as possible. And the investigation then thereafter kicks in. He records statements of witnesses under section 161 of CRPC. Those, it is not a signed statement, because any statement recorded by a police officer is inadmissible under section 25 of the Evidence Act. Now, all those statements are thereafter replicated in the case diary, and thereafter, depending on the case, he decides whether he needs search and seizure, etc. under section 94 of CRPC. He has wide plenary powers of investigation. Under 102, he has powers to attach. He has powers to even attach bank accounts, etc. And Thereafter, he has the power in case of a cognizable offense to make arrests. The only safeguard is that the arrested person, namely the accused, has to be produced before the jurisdictional magistrate under section 57. And there's also a constitutional safeguard under article 22 that he has to be produced within 24 hours of his arrest. Now, this is the first instance to interrogate the accused, and the accused has very little or absolutely no protection against abuse when he's arrested. Now, there are two things. One is the stigma attached to the arrest, and two could be the physical culpability that he has to undergo upon such arrest. Now, the legislature was conscious of the fact that we live in a democracy and a citizen has certain inalienable constitutional rights. Article 21 is at the helm of those constitutional rights. Now, having said that, Section 41 gives very, very wide powers to the police to make arrests. Now, under 41A, he could just give a questionnaire to the accused and ask him why he should not be arrested. And if the accused is cooperating, there is no need for an arrest. And the Supreme Court, in a judgment in Adridharan State of Bihar case, Justice Chandramauli's judgment, was it Adridharan Das?
Arnesh Kumar. Arnesh Kumar.
Arnesh Kumar. Thank you, Raj. It was Arnesh Kumar versus State of Bihar, Justice Chandramauli's judgment, where he's discussed 41A and why 41A should always be resorted to and not Section 41. Now, thereafter, the prosecuting agency is entitled to apply to the judge under Section 167 and ask for a police remand, because obviously 24 hours may not be enough if you step into the shoes of the prosecuting agency. And the judge, based on the material available in the case diary. Now, please mind it, this is very, very vital, that the case diary, if it indicates that a further custodial interrogation is required, the judge or the magistrate may remand the accused to police custody. Now, the maximum period of remand under Section 167(2) is 15 days. Now, what happens is, it is common knowledge as to what happens when an accused is remanded to police custody. More often than not, the accused undergoes, maybe mental or in some cases physical torture. Now, the accused has a right of silence under the Constitution, Article 20. And he cannot be made to testify against himself. Now, this is a constitutional safeguard that every accused has. Now, 167, in my opinion, is in the teeth of this constitutional guarantee provided for in the Constitution. Now, the accused, if he makes a confessional statement while in police custody, obviously it would be an extracted statement, yet that confessional statement, stricto sensu, would not be read in evidence, because there's a bar under Section 25 of the Indian Evidence Act, which says that statements recorded before a police officer is inadmissible in evidence. Having said that, there is another dichotomy in Section 27 of the Evidence Act, which says that if such a statement leads to discovery of a fact, that fact would be then taken into evidence. Now, what happens typically is that the accused is made to give a confessional statement, and the investigating agency is conscious of the fact that that will not be read in evidence. So what they do is, suppose in a murder case, they do not have the weapon. They would plant. I do not wish to generalize. I just want to tell you what happens in fact. They would plant the weapon, could be any weapon, at some place, and then they would say that the accused pointed out to that weapon at place X. So therefore the statement of the accused led to discovery of that weapon, and that weapon can then be taken into evidence. So now they have the weapon, and the accused would be in all likelihood convicted for having made such a statement or not having made such a statement. Now it is the job of the prosecution to prove its case to the hilt, and not the extracted confessional statement that is used against the accused, taking recourse to section 167 of CRPC. Now, the Supreme Court, in a celebrated case in D.K. Basu, laid down very, very strong measures as to how an accused has to be dealt with upon arrest and after being produced before the magistrate, and in case the magistrate grants police remand under 167. The accused has to be medically examined, etc. before remand and after remand when he is produced in court, just to ensure that there has not been any physical torture. Now we've been seeing various web series, etc., to understand as to how and what measures are undertaken by the police to still subject the accused to torture, which are not detected in medical examination. Now, another dichotomy in law is that a remand order is passed under 167 based on what is reflected in the case diary. And a case diary reflects the investigation carried out. Now, an accused has no right under section 172 CRPC to get a copy of the case diary. So he does not know what is written in the case diary. It is only if the judge uses some material in the case diary that he gets certain rights. So therefore, this, in my opinion, again, goes to the root of the matter and really affects fair trial and the right of an accused to get such trial. Now, the police, after investigation, file a charge sheet under section 173 of CRPC. Now, in the charge sheet, they have to, in case if the accused is in custody under section 167, in case of a heinous offense, the charge sheet has to be filed within 90 days. And if in case of a non-heinous offense, it has to be filed within 60 days. If not done so, then the accused has a right to get statutory bail. Now, before I proceed to the charge sheet, let me also discuss the law on bail and how in these changing times, what was perceived to be a matter of right has today been watered down to such an extent that getting bail today has become so difficult. I mean, when we were in college, the first sentence that we used to read in our books was, bail means no jail. Bail should be the norm and jail an exception. Now I believe the jurisprudence has been completely reversed. Unlike Western countries where you get bail as a matter of right, the court may put a huge bail bond as a condition or could subject the accused to further conditions, but bail is given as a matter of right. And if one reads 437 and 439, the bail conditions are inbuilt in the section itself. But today, bail has become extremely difficult, which again is a violation of a person's constitutional right, Article 21. Now, today we live in a democracy. We do not live in a police raj. So typically, if an FIR is registered by the police, whatever sections are invoked by the police in the FIR, and FIR is not an encyclopedia, it only reflects prima facie commission of a cognizable offense. So normally courts look at the sections invoked and whatever has been stated in the FIR to grant or reject. In my humble opinion, with all humility at my command, I say this, which is not the correct approach. Now today we know how FIRs are drafted by extremely astute lawyers who know what allegations to make, which would at least, go on to deny bail to an accused. And this happens in matrimonial matters, especially in property matters. I mean, this is how the law is abused. And in my opinion, especially in matrimonial matters, unless it's a very, very serious case or a case of dowry death under 304B, etc., one should get bail as a matter of right. And then face trial, and whatever consequence has to follow, must follow. And when we talk of anticipatory bail, we know anticipatory bail. I mean, earlier, if you look at Gurbakh Singh, CBI, etc., beautiful judgments, I mean, clearly pointing out as to what are the considerations for grant of anticipatory bail. But if we talk about the practical aspect of the matter, especially in the Supreme Court, I mean, I'm sorry to say this, anticipatory bail is something which the Supreme Court is extremely averse to, despite the fact that Article 21 is something that must be respected. And the court, the normal order that is passed by many of the courts, I would not say most, is, well, why don't you go and apply for regular bail? You have a good case and bail would be granted to you. I mean, little do they know, perhaps, for many of them who've not practiced in trial courts, is that trial courts do not grant bail for semi-heinous offenses. If the offense carries a sentence which is more than 3 years or more than 7 years, more often than not, the trial court would not grant you bail. And it is only that at the high court stage that you would get bail, and you would have suffered a pre-trial incarceration of at least 8 to 9 months or maybe 1 year before your matter is finally taken up by the High Court and the prosecution filing their reply, matter being heard, etc. So you would have spent 1 year. I mean, dehors the fact that you could be totally innocent and the FIR could be totally fabricated. And who knows, you may even succeed under 482 before the High Court. But you would have gone this compulsory incarceration for 8 to 9 months, 10 months before you get bail. So the point that I'm trying to make is that courts must be lenient in granting bail if a person has deep roots in the society, if the person would not abscond, he would not interfere with witnesses or tamper with evidence, and certain strict bail conditions are imposed, and to ensure that the accused cooperates fully with the trial. That is what we want to achieve. We don't want to keep pre-trial accused persons in languishing in jails. I mean, this is a complete violation of human rights. Now let me proceed further. Yes, I must also mention here that in offenses under the special statutes like PMLA, which has again thankfully been watered down by a beautiful judgment delivered by Justice Rohinton Nariman in Nikesh Tarachand Shah, where 45 was read down. and the twin conditions of bail, where the judge has to record his satisfaction that, in my opinion, I mean, at the FIR stage, in my opinion, the accused is not guilty. I mean, this is really like putting the cart before the horse. Such a draconian provision, thankfully, was watered down, but we have certain similar provisions in other statutes, like UAPA. UAPA is still understandable because it deals with proceeds, it deals with terrorism and proceeds relating to terrorist activities, etc. But getting bail even under the PMLA is an uphill task. And also getting bail under the Prevention of Corruption Act is something, I mean, judges take a very, very high moral ground, and getting bail under the Prevention of Corruption Act is also not very easy. I don't understand why judges should take such a high moral ground in PC Act matters, especially in a case where the accused is just an under trial. He's not a convicted felon. Maybe at the stage of 389, when he's finally convicted, the judges could be probably stricter because at least he's been convicted by one court. But certainly pre-conviction, I mean, the same normal, regular IPC laws should apply as in other statutes. Now, let us now come to the charge sheet. The moment a charge sheet is filed, a copy of the charge sheet, along with the entire case papers, including the statement of witnesses, etc., with a list of witnesses given to the accused. Under section 207 of CRPC, the accused is entitled for scrutiny of documents, and if there are any missing documents, etc., those documents are supplied to the accused. And this is in compliance with the rules of natural justice. Now, thereafter, if it's a sessions case, the case is committed to the sessions under 209. We have basically four kinds of trials. We have the sessions trial, we have the warrants trial. In fact, warrants trial is used by the sessions court. Then we have summons triable offenses, and then we have summary triable offenses. So I'm generally talking of a warrant trial case. Thereafter, now what is again very, very intriguing is that in most of the charge sheets, they would mention at the end that we reserve our right to file a supplementary charge sheet under section 173(8). Now, I have a huge problem with this. Why should you make the accused go through the rigors of a supplementary charge sheet? Why don't you do your job? And CRPC, I have again a very strong reservation, though it appears to be seamless, but most of the provisions in CRPC say at any stage of trial before judgment, which means that most of the provisions can be invoked at any stage of the proceedings. So 173(8) also is like a tool that an investigating agency and the prosecution reserve to themselves to bring about further material which may add to the complicity of the accused in a crime. Now thereafter, there are, the court is supposed to take cognizance under section 190. Now, cognizance is something which is not defined under CRPC. So as judicial precedents would indicate, that cognizance is first application of judicial mind. Now, there could be a huge discussion on this. Like first application of judicial mind, according to various judgments is, even if the judge says, well, why don't you examine your witnesses? Maybe in a summons triable case, even if he says this, it shows that he's applied his mind, and thereafter, it is taken as deemed cognizance. This is something which I am really, really averse to. If he says examine your witnesses, it could mean, well, looking at the complaint, I'm not satisfied. You examine your witnesses, let's see what evidence comes out. But there are, I'm sorry to say, many, many Supreme Court judgments which have taken the view that even if he says examine your witnesses, it shows application of judicial mind. So cognizance, as we understand, is application of judicial mind. Now, you just present a charge sheet to any judge. I know that there are a few judges on our webinar today, And let me tell them that there is hardly any application of judicial mind. They take cognizance mechanically and summons are issued. In 99.99% cases, the charge sheet is filed and mechanical cognizance is taken by the judge concerned, the magistrate concerned, and summons are issued to the accused. Now, once summons are issued to the accused, it is at this stage that the accused has a right to put forth his case. Now, the first charges are to be framed. There is an argument on charge. And once a charge is framed, the accused is asked whether he pleads guilty or not guilty. He says not guilty, trial commences. Now, it is at this stage that the prosecution has to lead its evidence. And the prosecution thereafter leads its evidence. The accused has a right to cross-examine. After the prosecution evidence is complete, the material, all the adverse material that comes out post-prosecution evidence, the trying magistrate has to put every adverse material that has come out in the prosecution evidence to the accused and to elicit a reply. Now, any intelligent criminal lawyer understands that this is the stage where he has to start building his defense. Now, this is what we generally call our 313 proceedings. Now, section 313 CRPC provides for questions being put by the judge to the accused. Now, if you look at most of the trial papers, you would find, and especially all my friends who are practicing criminal law, and plus I also want to put this to all students who want to practice criminal law, is that if you look at the case papers and Mr. Raj Kamal, he's been practicing on the criminal side, and also Mr. Mihir, who's also been practicing on the criminal side, would agree with me that you look at the case papers and you'll find that the answer to 99.99% of the questions posed by the judge is no, a bald no, or I am innocent. So at the 313 stage, the accused does not start building his defense, which may actually prove to be to his peril at the later stage, when he has to lead defense evidence. Now, at the stage of defense evidence, the accused, in many of the cases we've seen that the lawyer chooses to examine the accused. Now, an accused has a right of silence under the Constitution. So this is a mistake that none of us should make by exposing an accused and taking away his right of silence in the box, because then he's also exposed himself to testify against himself and given a huge rope, a long rope to the prosecution to cross-examine him. Now, I see this happening in many of the moot courts also, national moot courts. So please address this problem and rectify this problem. And thereafter, the arguments are heard by both sides, and then the judge decides one way or the other. So I have very broadly explained the contours of a criminal trial, initially criminal investigation, leading to a criminal trial. Now, I just want to address you on the third limb of my webinar, which is, now let's start with the first aspect that we've already dealt with, namely the inalienable human rights that a citizen of this country has. Now, despite the fact that he may be suffering incarceration, he may have been arrested by the police, there are certain basic safeguards that he has under the Constitution first and under CRPC second. CRPC must bow to the Constitution. The provisions leading to arrests, namely 41A, must be strengthened, and in rarest of rare cases, arrest should be resorted to. That's my first argument. Number two, if you have made arrests and if you think that custodial interrogation is necessary under section 167, adequate safeguard should be provided. The accused must at all times be given access to his lawyer, which is again a constitutional guarantee under Article 22. All questions must be posed to him in front of his lawyer. If the accused does not answer a question, that should not be read as an adverse instance against him. Now, to deny bail, we would often hear one parrot-like argument. Well, sir, he's not cooperating. I mean, what is the accused expected to do? To go and sign his death warrant in police custody. Of course, the accused is not expected to cooperate if there are instances adverse to him. You are the prosecution and you have to prove your case to the hilt. You cannot, if you've asked for documents under section 91, the accused has a right to deny those documents to you. So therefore, cooperation, I do not understand what is the meaning of cooperation. So therefore, and especially section 27 must be read down or interpreted to fall in line with section 25 of the Evidence Act, because discovery of fact would lead to discovery pursuant to a confessional statement, which happens in 99% of the cases where the accused is in police custody pursuant to a police remand. So you are not supposed to prove your case by the might of the danda. You are supposed to do your investigation and thereafter take the case to its logical conclusion. And therefore, even, I mean, section 25 of the Evidence Act has been there from the inception. So even a Brit could understand that the cops would make the canary sing because of the fear of the danda. So therefore, this constitutional safeguard under 25, when 25 of the Evidence Act was incorporated, there was no Article 21 in that sense, because the Constitution came in 1950. Yet, a Brit was conscious of the fact of the police excesses that he could foresee and incorporated 25. But 25, unfortunately, has been watered down by 27, which is something that the legislature needs to address. Now, let me come to the fourth limb of my webinar. Now, when we talk of investigation and trial, I want to very briefly compare what happens in the West. And by West, I don't want to take instances of either UK or US, etc. It's more or less the same. A typical state in the US, one would know, would have a district attorney's office. Now we know that law and order is a state subject, and the state is expected to ensure that rule of law is adhered to in a state. Now they would have typically a district attorney's office, and the district attorney's office is charged with complete prosecution of a case. Now, when we talk of prosecution, they also have police stations like we have. The moment a crime is committed, the district attorney's office is informed, and along with the investigating agency right from day one, the district attorney's office is involved, and the district attorney's office and the police, the investigating agency, they work in tandem. Now, both agencies visit the crime scene and ensure that the crime scene is not polluted. They take charge of the crime scene, and then they ensure that complete forensics is carried out. I would a little later deal with the forensic aspect of it. Now, in our country, what happens is that the prosecution branch or the right hand has absolutely no knowledge of what is being done by the left hand. They proceed like two parallel roads which do not intersect at any place. The first time that they intersect is when a final charge sheet is prepared and the charge sheet is sent to the prosecution branch for vetting. Now, the prosecution branch has absolutely no idea how the investigation has been carried out, etc. But for the case diary, it raises, and again I say that most of my friends who are practicing criminal law would know, it raises formal objections like our registry does to our special leave petitions to say, when it's not paginated, well, you file this document, etc. So what it does is that it raises certain objections. Those objections are cleared and the charge sheet is filed in court. So there is zero application of mind on behalf of the prosecution branch, but for the, as I said, these objections, etc., which are mostly formal in nature, and a charge sheet is filed. So what I would again very, very strongly recommend is that we must adopt the way investigation is carried out in the Western countries and ensure that both the prosecution and the investigating agency, they work in tandem. Now, I also want to highlight another very, very critical aspect. If you want to have real justice in criminal trials being meted out to the accused, your forensics have to be very, very strong. In the Western countries, the moment a crime is committed, the forensic team rushes to the crime scene, first ensure that the crime scene is not polluted. Now we talk of very, very basic things like fingerprinting, ballistics, and DNA. I am not going into the nitty-gritties of the other aspects of forensics. Let us stick to these 3 points. In most of the cases, if you've got your forensics right, you will get the conviction right. If you have matching fingerprints, if you have matching DNA, because in most of the cases, you will find something or the other which would link the DNA to the proper accused. We know that the ballistic science is so advanced that you know actually which gun has fired which bullet. Now we have very, very few credible central forensic science laboratories, and they are also very, very overworked. You have one in Hyderabad, you have one in Delhi, perhaps the oldest is in Calcutta. Though you may have many forensic science laboratories, but only these 3-4 are very, very credible forensic science laboratories. So you must ensure that your forensic science is something which is given a very, very, is of extreme significance. Now I come to the 5th limb of my argument. Please ensure. Now, all of you must have heard of the concept of plea bargain. Now, there was an amendment in CRPC, and we have section 265A, which provides for plea bargaining. Now, plea bargaining essentially means that the accused at any stage can bargain for a reduced sentence from the prosecution, from the court, and ask for a lesser conviction. The plea, it can only happen after post-conviction. So what happens typically is, though this provision has been introduced in our criminal system, one, it is seldom used, and two, most of my friends would be astonished to note that the rate of conviction in our country is a minuscule 48%. And when we talk of 48%, this is inclusive of heinous and non-heinous crimes. The rate of conviction for rape cases is an abysmal 27.2%. There is a problem somewhere. And if we want to address that problem, we must address our forensics. If you expect plea bargain to take a concrete shape, you must have your forensics right. I say this for the reason that an accused person is conscious of the fact that 7 out of 10 times he would go scot-free. So why would he resort to plea bargain? His lawyers would tell him, well, you can take advantage of the system right from the inception. When a crime is registered, at the first instance, you have the investigating officer. You can go and manage the investigating officer. If the investigating officer cannot be managed, then you have the second stage, which means the prosecution. The prosecution, if the prosecution is lax, you have the third stage, where the judge has no evidence. The judge then obviously cannot be compelled to convict a person because there is no evidence. So investigation is flawed. Prosecution has not done its job because the investigation is flawed, which ultimately leads to acquittal of accused. If you have your forensics right, at the first instance, the moment an FIR is registered and the accused is apprehended, the prosecution at that stage could put the complete material before the accused to show him, look, this is the kind of credible evidence we have against you, and 9 out of 10 times you would be convicted. And if you do not take plea bargain at this stage, if ultimately you suffer conviction, we would then ask for maximum sentence. That's at the stage of FIR. Post FIR, at the stage of charge sheet, again the prosecution could show the entire material to the accused and say, look, this is the kind of material we have against you. We have your DNA, we have your fingerprints, we have maybe your ballistics, and all this is completely conclusive evidence. You have no way of getting scot-free. And at that stage, maybe the accused could resort to plea bargain. Unless you have your forensics right, your plea bargain just remains in the statute books, which would seldom be invoked, because ultimately what you want is conviction and not the maximum sentence for the accused. So if you want your plea bargain to work, I want to mention here that Justice Deepak Mishra, this was our ex-Chief Justice Deepak Mishra's pet project, and he really wanted plea bargain to take off, but unfortunately even now it has not really taken off. Now, the advantage with plea bargain is that it would reduce the number of cases actually going to trial. And this would then ensure that even courts are not overburdened with work. I mean, all of us know the kind of burden that, we have a few thousand judges in our entire country. Dealing with, we only have, look at the humongous pendency of cases and the number of judges we have. We have close to 650 High Court judges in the entire country against 1078, which is the sanction strength, which even now is very little, but we are not able to fill up our vacancies. And the cases, the pendency keeps on mounting every day. So if you will resort to things like plea bargain, this would also reduce pendency of cases. And reduction in pendency of cases means expeditious trial. And expeditious trial means that ultimately people would be getting a fair sentence, fair conviction, which would ensure rule of law. And at the end of it, what we want is that rule of law should prevail. So I think this brings us to the last segment of my webinar. And now I would invite people to, Raj, can you ask them to pose questions to me?
Yes. Sir, so one of the questions I will put across Dr. Madhukar Sharma. He asks a question, sir, does section 154 mechanism prescribes to due process ensured under Article 21 of the Constitution? Because post Lalita Kumari, there is no process altogether in registration of FIR. What are your views on this, sir?
See, Lalita Kumari basically takes 154 forward. 154 has not been watered down to in that sense, but Lalita Kumari says two things. Firstly, that if a complaint discloses commission of a cognizable offense, you have no option, you must register an FIR and then take investigation to its logical conclusion. Now, it categorizes certain offenses where there could be a requirement of pre-investigation before registering an FIR. We've seen that in many cases pertaining to especially commercial law, cases pertaining to matrimonial law, etc., where there has been a complete departure insofar as invoking the correct principle of law is concerned. An FIR is used as a tool to obviously exploit the accused. And because the law says that if a complaint is filed which discloses commission of an offense, an FIR must be registered to safeguard the right of the accused, guaranteed and protected under Article 21. Lalita Kumar reads down 154 to this very, very small extent to ensure that rule of law is preserved and Article 21 safeguard is available to the accused.
Thank you, sir. So we have a query from Mr. Alok Kumar. He asks, I'll quote, how does one balance or option for accused for protection under Section 25 of Evidence Act with statutes such as PMLA, which have penal provisions, imprisonments, etc., but officers are deemed not to be police officers? Similar provisions also exist under the Custom Act, sir. What are your views on this, sir?
You know, that's a very, very good question, and I totally agree with you. PMLA number 1 has certain draconian provisions. Now, you are absolutely right in saying that Section 25 clearly says that statement recorded before a police officer is inadmissible as evidence. But under these sections, the Enforcement Directorate and its officers are not police as understood under the Evidence Act. And I totally agree with you. Any statement extracted in custody, be it before the ED or be it before the police, must face the same rigors of Section 25 of the Evidence Act. And I totally agree with you. The law needs a relook as far as this is concerned. There is a complete dichotomy. And I must also tell you that the first judgment was delivered by Justice Kabir, who took this view, and then the law has been a little fluid as far as this aspect is concerned.
Thank you, sir. So one of our professors, Meera Matthew, she poses a question, quoting, Unnao rape victim was set on fire by accused while sent on bail. Do you still feel that the subjective parameters set by the court or at the discretion of judiciary in granting bail is justified?
You know, extraordinary cases and extraordinary facts make bad law. While I totally agree with you that there are instances which are barbaric, and the accused, upon being released on bail, may have committed such heinous crimes, which can obviously nobody can justify such things, but bad facts may make. Now, I do agree that in cases which involve a sentence of life or capital punishment, etc., the courts must be circumspect in granting bail in those matters, and must look at the overall picture. I do not justify bail being granted in a very, very serious case of rape. Now, having said that, we must also not be oblivious to the fact that there are many cases where there is a false allegation of rape. There are many cases where two adults are living under the same roof and there is a consensual sex between them. And if the relationship goes sour, then there could be an allegation of rape. There are instances of promise to marry, and then if things don't work out, there are rape charges being slapped on the other side. So one must back in a case Unnao. That's it, Raj.
Thank you, sir. So now, before going to the next question in the Q&A box, I will ask a couple of participants who wants to ask live question. Mr. Avinash Singh Vaishyan, can you unmute yourself and ask your question to sir?
Thank you, sir. Sir, I have two questions, and if it's okay, I'd first like to ask the first question, and after you've answered, I'd like to ask the second question.
Please go ahead.
So my first question is that, as you stated that the case diary is the primary document that is considered before granting police custody or judicial custody. From the prosecution side, that is the primary document that is looked at. So does this use of the case diary not entitle an accused to take the same under consideration for their perusal?
Just open the door. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
No, but I could not hear the question properly.
Mr. Avinash Singh Vaishyan,
Can you please repeat it?
Yes, sir. Sir, as you stated that the case diary is the primary document that is considered before granting police custody or judicial custody in the first instance. So does this use of the case diary not entitle the defense to use it for their perusal as well?
Well, what happens is that at the stage of bail at the first instance, the court has no other material but to see how an investigation has progressed. So it has no other material but the case diary, which records how an investigating officer has conducted himself and how, in which direction has the investigation gone forward. So therefore, at the stage of bail, that case diary is used. So, but under section 172 of CRPC, the accused is not entitled to get a copy of the case diary because the judge makes up the judge formulates his mind on the aspect of grant of bail or grant of police remand. That's the only limited point on which the case diary can be used. And therefore, this is something that the accused must be entitled to ensure rules of fair play. That's why I had criticized section 172 of CRPC. We are ad idem on this.
Thank you, sir. Now my second question is that in special reference to the United States, they have a probable cause hearing in cases where warrant is not taken while a search and seizure is carried out. Now, if you draw a parallel to that in India, we have the statutory requirement of 165 for warrants. However, there are exceptions provided. Now, due to the police practices, this exception has been made the rule. They do not care for getting warrants in any case except in circumstances where it may relate to somebody who is a very high profile person. And this leads to a disparity between the two classes that have been created by the police practices itself. So do you think that a probable cause hearing, which is where a search and seizure has been carried out without a warrant, should be instituted in India as well, so that a judicial mind can apply as to see whether the search and seizure, the materials that are taken under the search and seizure, are allowed or not?
You know, that's a brilliant question. And this is the point that I was trying to bring home in the opening of our webinar. I also very, very strongly feel that we live in a democracy and not in a police raj. When these provisions like section 94, 102, etc. were incorporated, at that time, we did not have this concept of independent India. So if you want to ensure rules of fair play, there must be an application of mind even in cases where search and seizure is required. Only in very, very exceptional cases where the evidence could disappear, that the police should be given the power to go to give the provision a go by. Otherwise, in all cases of search and seizure, there must be a formal warrant by the court concerned.
Thank you, sir. We have a next participant asking a question. Mr. Amit Sharma, can you unmute yourself and ask the query?
Yes, first of all, let me just say that it was an enlightening experience. We were all enlightened by a very, very good webinar that I attended. See, my question is related to the case diary. Now, as far as the case diary is concerned, and we all understand that whenever a bail application for bail is moved before the High Court, the first thing the judge or the magistrate, wherever it is moved, the first thing the court does is it calls for the case diary. Now, we all know that the access to the case diary, of course, is not available to the accused. How proper it is to, in fact, go into the case diary to decide the bail, because bail ultimately, according to me, should be completely on the basis of FIR.
Thank you so much for the compliment, Amit. I totally agree with you. What happens in most of the cases is that we've seen with we know from our experience in the High Court that even in cases where a charge sheet has been filed, at the stage of bail, the High Court still summons the case diary. Now, this is something which I really do not or cannot appreciate. Once a charge sheet is filed, when the entire evidence is before the High Court, why should the High Court call for a case diary? A case diary must be used by the trial court only when a charge sheet is not filed and it does not have access to the materials indicating as to how an investigation has progressed. And therefore, it is only on those parameters that the court should decide on grant or rejection of bail. I totally agree with you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Pandey Neeraj Rai, could you unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, all of the panelists. Thank you for the very enlightening session again. My question pertains to the legal position that has been introduced in our country since last 8 years. We all know Lavesh judgment of the Supreme Court of 2012, which introduces a relationship between Section 82 process and anticipatory bail. Anticipatory bail was never a matter of right, but with this judgment, what has happened is the right of consideration of anticipatory bail, which is a statutory right, also gets forfeited the moment a process under Section 82 has been issued rightly or wrongly. And what happens is when a process under Section 82 has been issued, the remedy for the person who wants to seek his first opportunity of anticipatory bail, he has to file an application for quashment of that process and then undergo all the rigors. And by the time he comes for anticipatory bail, again a fresh process is issued. So, in taking recourse to all these statutory remedies, virtually what is happening is that the right of consideration of anticipatory bail is being seriously jeopardized. So, what is your view on this?
Thank you so much, Neeraj. I entirely agree with you, and I do not consider that judgment to be a legally sound judgment, because we know from our experience that an 82 process is issued, especially in high-profile matters, in matters of weeks, to defeat an application under Section 438 for grant of anticipatory bail. The first thing that the prosecution does is to go to the court, file an application under Section 82, And if possible, if process under 82 is issued declaring the person as a proclaimed offender, then the concept of anticipatory becomes totally otious, because the accused then has to present himself before the magistrate or the court concerned, so that 82 process is withdrawn. If he appears before the court concerned, then where is the question of grant of anticipatory bail? Because then he would be taken into custody and then he would have to apply for regular bail. So to defeat 438, this is a very, very draconian tool that the prosecution uses. And I totally agree with you that 82, unless it's a case where the accused is absconding for years together, if the application of an accused is pending before the court concerned, then 82 should be of no consequence. I repeat, 82 should be of no consequence, because the accused has already availed of his remedy under section 438 of CRPC. Thank you, Neeraj.
Thank you, sir. We have Mr. Arjun Chaturvedi who will ask the next question, please.
Am I audible?
Yes, please.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you, panel, for allowing me to ask a question. Mr. Das, it's been a pleasure to hear your domain expertise on the matter. I'm a visiting faculty with Symbiosis. I'm also a practicing lawyer in the trial courts. And my experience has been that those who are accused of a criminal offense are from the lower socioeconomic class. So far we've been talking about those from the higher economic class. They are involved in white collar offenses. But those from the lower socioeconomic class, when they are interrogated by the police, then invariably they're made to sign a document which works out to be a confession. Now, even though the confession is no longer admissible as evidence against the accused, unless the accused tells before the judge that, yes, I have indeed committed the crime, the police report is admitted by the court prior to the framing of charge. Now, that admission is also based on the confession document. Now, why is it that in our procedure, we don't have a system, especially with information technology so common now, where the police is forced to record the confession, whether it's admissible or not, to record it in order for the court to at least see whether there has been coercion or duress on the face of it? Why is it that in the vast majority of cases, police report is easily admitted by the trial court? That's my question, sir. Thank you.
See, that's again a very, very good question, and that's one of the criticism that I had against section 167 of CRPC, which gives the police to apply for a police remand. Now, in my view, there could be two possibilities. One, that when an accused is interrogated, that interrogation must be before his, the presence of his lawyer must be allowed. That's one. Number two, all interrogations must be in camera. This could be another solution. So therefore, to obviate the possibility of police excesses, these two things could be resorted to. Now to the second part of your question, when you say that a confessional statement is admitted by the court, so the confessional statement is admitted only to the extent of discovery of a fact and not the entire confessional statement itself, because there's a legal bar under section 25 of the Evidence Act. So only the discovery part is admitted as evidence before the court and not the other part of the confessional statement. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Manish Mohan wants to ask a question, sir. He asks, how can the police force be sensitized for ensuring scientific investigation of crimes under the present landscape of CRPC? And his additional follow-up question is, what are the remedies available with a defense counsel for ensuring scientific investigation of crimes under the CRPC?
See, thank you so much, Manish. That's a very, very brilliant question. Unfortunately, the accused has no role in ensuring, in our scheme of things, as to how an investigation is to take place. Now, how an investigation is to take place, it is provided for under the CRPC. Now, there have been amendments under the Evidence Act. We know that emails, etc., are admissible now. You have recordings admissible under the Evidence Act. There are many judgments under Section 65B of the Evidence Act, which provide as to how electronic evidence is to be admitted in court, and that a certificate is to be provided by the person downloading the content, the data, etc. So I would not say that time has frozen in that sense, but yes, much remains to be done. And I must also add here that a follow-up to this question is that now you have video conferencing facilities. Now, there are very, very small things like an accused being taken to court from jail for every hearing. I mean, even for procedural hearing matters. I mean, why on earth would you have to do that? The accused, no substantive right of the accused is affected. The accused could be very well in jail, and he could be produced through video conferencing in only at the stage of evidence when he has to physically be present, that his presence could be required in court in person. We would save so much of time and money. So I totally agree with Manish that much needs to be done, but time has not frozen, and we are, proceeding in the right direction. So kudos to the Supreme Court and kudos to the High Court for, starting with virtual courts, that even during this pandemic, I mean, rule of law is still being, is not a casualty. Thank you, Manish.
Sir, another question. In the beginning of your lecture, you talked about the jurisprudence regarding bail as to how bail used to be the rule and jail used to be an exception. But now the jurisprudence seems to have reversed. Mr. Apekshit Singh wants to know what is the reason for such reversal according to you? Why this jurisprudence seems to have reversed these days?
See, it can't be a simple answer. One possibility or one possible answer could be that there has been a surge in the rate of crime in the recent past. With the population explosion, the rate of crime has increased exponentially. So this could be one factor, that judges today are not very keen in granting bail. I mean, that's perhaps one of the most important reasons that I could really look at. But obviously there are other allied reasons also, like the kind of pressure that an individual has in today's times. For example, during the pandemic, the rate of crime initially had really gone down, but now there's been a surge. So these are possible reasons. And also, one very important aspect is the misuse of bail, that people have misused the liberty given to them. And this has also perhaps made courts very conservative these days. Thank you, Mihir.
Thank you, sir. So one of the participants, Mr. Purvish Malkhan, asked a question that with regards to supplementary charge sheet, he says that writing a clause at bottom of every charge sheet that the police is reserving right to file supplementary charge sheet, does it make any difference? Even without mentioning this, under 173 clause 8 CRPC, the police has all the right to further investigate a matter. What are your views on this, sir?
See, Purvish, that's the point that I was trying to make. This sentence that they write at the end of the charge sheet is only because of 173(8) of CRPC, and not, they have no other residuary power. This power is available only under 173(8). So I have a huge problem with 173(8). Why should you not? I mean, how can you reserve this power with you? And what if this power is exercised at a later stage? There would be a de novo trial again, which would again affect the right of the accused.
Thank you, sir. So one other participant, he asked a question, Mr. Vikram Singh, I'll quote. So what if accused at stage stages cite through an affidavit to police that whatever he said or deposed, it would be told at the stage of trial under realm of Article 20, Clause 3, will it prevail over 167 of CRPC and 27 of Indian Evidence Act? And why the lawyers do not do this or teachers teach this? What is the legal glitch in this approach, sir?
See, that's a very, very innovative question, I must say. You are right that Article 20, Subarticle 3 clearly provides that no one can be compelled to testify against himself. So this is exactly the point that I was trying to make, is that despite this constitutional guarantee, I mean, Constitution is the mother of all laws, and all laws must be in consonance with the Constitution. So this is precisely the point that I was trying to make, is that despite this constitutional guarantee, you still have provisions in the CRPC and the Evidence Act which give a leeway to the police and the prosecution to take away this constitutional guarantee, which is obviously something that needs a relook. And these provisions need to be amended so that it is brought in tune with the constitutional guarantee.
Thank you, sir. One other participant, Mr. Anurag Iyer, he has a question with regard to Section 313 of CRPC. He says, I quote, what is the implication of a failure to put incriminating circumstances to the accused under Section 313 CRPC, and the same failure is found to be prejudicial by the appellate court? In light of the judgment of Supreme Court in the case of Narsingh versus State of Haryana, which course of action is most likely to be taken by the appellate court, and what factors are to be taken into consideration with reference to the same? Sir.
See, 313 is a very, very important safeguard. It's like a safety valve that the accused has. If an incriminating circumstance which may lead to the conviction of an accused is not put to him, it would definitely lead to the acquittal of the accused. Now, this is not something like 462 of CRPC where a procedural irregularity is saved. This cannot be countenanced, such a situation cannot be countenanced, and failure of the court to put an incriminating factor or evidence to the accused would lead to his acquittal.
Thank you. Sir, another question by Mr. Akshata Chabra. He says, I'll quote, sir, as we all know, the atrocities faced by the detainees when in police custody, to what all provisions can they resort to?
As I said, that you must read the judgment of the Supreme Court in D.K. Basu. D.K. Basu has given extensive guidelines as to how an under trial prisoner or somebody who is taken for on police remand is to be treated, etc., and the protocols that are required to be followed. In case if those protocols are not followed, one can approach either the trial court itself or the constitutional court, that is the High Court. The High Court under Section 482 has very, very wide plenary powers to come to the aid of the accused. In fact, there's been a petition in the Supreme Court by Dr. Abhishek Manu Singhvi based on the guidelines of D.K. Basu. That matter is pending in the Supreme Court.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Arindam Ghosh asks, I'll quote, don't you think that the learned judges of the trial court are extremely conservative, or rather quite skeptical to grant bail in cognizable matters, even if the merits bail is warranted?
See, I want to reflect on this. I totally agree with Mr. Arindam Ghosh. Now, unfortunately, I mean, some of us know with our knowledge that, you know, there is an unsaid diktat issued to the trial court judges, wherein they are asked not to grant bail in certain offenses, certain semi-heinous offenses, which according to me is not correct, because the trial court has ample powers. It is the jurisdictional court, and it must decide based on the merits on a case-to-case basis and not be guided by the sections invoked by the police in a matter. I totally agree with Mr. Arvind Ghosh.
Thank you, sir. We have one more live question, and then we will take a last few questions. Mr. Abhishek Kaushik, can you unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
Good afternoon, and thank you again for taking time out on Sunday afternoon for us. My question is rather on a practical side. Earlier in adultery cases where the adulterous person was accused, and then of course he would face trial. After the judgment of Supreme Court making adultery not as a crime, what should be his role when he is added as a defendant in matrimonial dispute between the husband and the wife? Now he has a very peculiar situation. He is not an accused, but his disclosure would lead to divorce or not lead to divorce. In such a scenario, what should be the course of action to be adopted by such a person who is accused of having adulterous relationship with the wife of the third person?
See, I can only say that's, in lighter vein, that he may not be a necessary party, but he may be a proper party under Order 1, Rule 10.
No, but the divorce proceedings require him to be added as a necessary party. It has to be
because so therefore he would definitely, he can be summoned as a witness in a proceeding where he is related. Therefore, we have this concept of a necessary party or a proper party. So even if he is not a necessary party, he could still be a proper party. Because I'll tell you why. If somebody needs to prove a case of adultery against his wife, then her paramour may be a very, very important witness for him to do so in court. So he could still summon that person. Dehors the fact whether he is a party formally to those proceedings or not. He could be summoned as a witness.
Exactly why the question. What should be his stand then?
If suppose he files an application himself to be deleted as a party, and if the court deletes him, right, as a defendant, he could still be summoned as a witness and his evidence could be taken into account. So it is of no consequence whether he is a party or not.
No, my question more was whether he should exercise 20 clause 3 to prevent his own reputation that I don't want to speak because it will be against myself. My reputation will be affected and therefore my rights under Article 20 clause 3 will be affected.
No, absolutely not. He should have thought about his reputation before getting into such an act.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There's Mr. Abhinandan Sharma. He asked a question about the rights of preliminary inquiry of police before registering of the FIR and the evidentiary value of the same, sir.
See, because of the judgment of the Constitution Bench, judgment of the Supreme Court in Lalita Kumar, we have this concept of a preliminary inquiry only in certain categories of cases. Otherwise, the concept of a preliminary inquiry before registration of an FIR was a concept unheard of in criminal law, criminal jurisprudence. But because this safety valve has been provided by the Supreme Court in this judgment, so it's only in commercial disputes, etc., and in matrimonial matters, etc., that such a preliminary inquiry is resorted to. Otherwise, your question is a very, very valid question. The concept of inquiry is in criminal matters is again a concept alien to criminal law, because in criminal matters you have investigation. You have, though these words are interchangeably used in CRPC, but otherwise you have an inquiry under the Commission of Inquiries Act. That is from where the concept of inquiry flows from. So this inquiry is just to ascertain whether it discloses commission of a cognizable offense. Otherwise, this inquiry is of no consequence. It is only for the purposes of registration of the FIR. That's it.
Thank you, sir. So we have an anonymous question. The query is that with the blurring difference between the civil and criminal proceeding these days, do you think the criminal jurisprudence as it evolved through common law clearly stated that criminal law should be used as a last resort for the more reprehensible wrongful acts for the punitive and stringent punishment. However, with the criminalization of civil dispute, is the jurisprudence blurring, sir? This is the question.
See, let us not go to the common law. We are not concerned with common law when you have your own codified law. Now, what you're saying is absolutely right, for the reason that you go to a smart lawyer in Delhi today with a problem. Okay, it could be a pure commercial dispute. And the lawyer would tell you, well, let us invoke the criminal law first. Let us file a complaint with the EOW. Thereafter, we'll file a civil suit. Now, the reason is that, as I said, that the matter that may have two facets, a criminal law facet and a civil law facet. Even if it does not have a criminal law facet, yet in many cases, criminal law is set in motion. Now, if you do the reverse, if you file a civil case, then you are precluded from filing a criminal case. Because then obviously the accused would come and say, look, this is an afterthought and this is a pure civil dispute and your criminal case may be quashed on this ground alone. So we lawyers are also responsible for invoking criminal law in matters which are purely of a civil nature. So this is clearly an abuse of process.
Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you.
Sir, one participant, Mr. Shamik Narayan, he asked a question with regard to the admissibility of the certificate under Section 65B of the Evidence Act with the conflicting decision of Navjot Sandhu and thereafter PV Anbar, which is now clarified by Justice Rohinton's latest judgment.
Yes,
What do you think should be the right approach, sir?
See, Anwar PV was Justice Kurian's judgment. Then we had Justice Madan Lokur's judgment. And now you have Justice Nariman's judgment, latest judgment probably, which came out 10 days ago. According to me, 65B is very, very categorical. My own view is that the person who downloads, I'm just giving one example, data from the source computer. Now, otherwise, if you do not have a certificate under Section 65B, then who would you hold accountable or who would prove that evidence in court? So therefore, a certificate under Section 65B is mandated in law to say, look, this is the source computer. This was the data available in the source computer. This is the hard disk of the source computer. And this is the download that I made from the source computer. You have everything before you. You can match the number of the computer as you have an IMEI number in mobile phones. You have a similar number in the computer where you can collate both the things, the data download and the computer. So therefore, and the person who's done it, it is imperative that 65B certificate must be filed along with the original source computer, the hard disk and the data download.
Thank you, sir. So we have Dr. Madhukar Sharma. He would ask the last question for the day. Dr. Madhukar Sharma, if you can please.
Yes. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Sir, my submission and then the question is this, that like Lalita Kumari is not a logical judgment. Logical judgment, I mean to say that it is not based upon any legal logical argument. It is more a fact-based judgment that what happened that in one case, Lalita Kumari, police failed to register the FIR, so pass an order that registration of FIR is necessary, is compulsory for you people. Similarly, DK Basu, similarly, Neelabati Behera. Okay, fine. Police had killed Neelabati Behera's son, so pass an order that give the compensation to the victim. Sir, it is irony that in India especially, that why our judgment or why our legislative rule making bodies, why they do not look into the complete facts, why we do not conduct the research and then come out the conclusion that okay, fine, that in such and such number of cases, such and such is the reason for, like for example, that okay, fine, we have mere 48% conviction rate. Other way around, 52% acquittal rate. But actually, what is the reason behind conviction? Is it the poor investigation? Was it the poor prosecution? Reason could be that witness had turned hostile. Reason could be that it was a false complaint. We compare the system of India with the Western system altogether blindly. Why do we feel hallucinated with the Western system without looking into the ground realities in India? When we see that the Western system, the Western criminal law is primarily research-based system, but we have not started yet. They had already completed their journey in the 1970s and 1960s. So, sir, my point, my submission and my question from you is this: that what is your view? That why should not we promote empirical research in the criminal law? Why the Supreme Court always feel disinclined to look into the empirical research based conclusions or reports submitted before the Supreme Court?
Can I answer?
Yes, sir.
See, you've peppered me with so many questions. So I would just like to quote Bob Dylan here. You may say that I am a dreamer, but I am not the only one. Okay, so 73 years have gone by. Since we gained independence in 1950, we gave to ourselves a constitution. When I advocate the Western system, I do not for a moment suggest that we blindly ape the Western system. What I suggest is that we must try and take out good things from the Western system. Now, when the concept of virtual courts, in fact, the concept of video conferencing came into being, and people were very, very skeptical that it just can't work. We experimented video conferencing for matters involving transfer petitions before the Supreme Court. And gradually, most of the trial courts today in India have a video conference facility. So therefore, it obliterated the boundaries, the traditional boundaries that we used to have earlier. Now, when virtual courts started, nobody was satisfied. I'm still not very satisfied. I believe that we could still have better softwares. We have video in the Supreme Court and we have WebEx in the High Court. You could still, so therefore we are evolving every day. There cannot be a quick fix solution to these problems. Now, when I advocate forensics which is the way forward. There needs to be an overhaul in the entire system. I also advocate reforms in CRPC and IPC and the Evidence Act. Now there's a crying need for police reforms. Till now, despite so many, despite the judgment of the Supreme Court in Prakash Singh and so many follow-up judgments like a continuing mandamus by the Supreme Court with regard to police reforms, we have achieved something, but much is desired. So therefore, to end the webinar, I say that you may think that I am a dreamer, but I am not the only one. Thank you.
Thank you.
May I say something, sir?
If it is not 4 questions concealed in one.
Sir, I didn't mean you, sir, when I said that.
No, correct.
Yes.
Not at all.
I specifically mentioned the Supreme Court thing, sir, that they do not take these things into consideration.
And you are right that I also have strong reservations with Lalita Kumari's judgment. See, the problem is that people who are, who have practiced on the criminal side do not travel to the bench. Very few of them actually travel to the bench, say the High Court and thereafter the Supreme Court. So there is, after Justice M.K. Mukherjee, who was one of the best judges we had on the criminal side, there have been very few, very eminent judges who've done only criminal law. So we need judges who've also practiced on the criminal law if you want good judgments coming out of the high courts and the Supreme Courts on the criminal side.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Sir, for the enlightening lecture. Now I'll invite Dr. C.J. Ravandle sir to make the concluding remark, and then Mr. Kumar Mihir to extend the vote of thanks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Anupam, for the session. And I could see there should be more questions. I could see that in the Q&A box, and it shows that the session did raise the bar, and of course there were several thought-provoking comments, statements made by you based upon the law applicable. What I could see, well, as a learner of law, I have been taught that if you want to know the civilization, study the criminal law of that land. But today's situation is which kind of civilization we are in, because the law has not changed for many years possibly. And criminal justice administration, what I studied, I would like to just put it under 4 heads. Earlier it was just teach. Then came the period just don't teach but preach. And then came the 3rd page, just don't teach and preach but practice too. And today I feel that it is just do it. So just do not tell why do we do it, why should we do it. So it is just do it, and that's what the judgments which I was just seeing. As it was rightfully said, we have that penchant for the laws abroad. So there is a very famous tale. So I will just say this English proverb, and then I'll end the talk with the Sanskrit verb on that. It is said, when there is a goose on the trial side, there ought not to be a fox on the jury. Which clearly talks about the fair trial. But whose fair trial? Because we always feel that it is the accused who is on trial. But I think that the entire justice system is on trial. Like, do you really govern yourself that there is an accused before you? And in this whole thing, we forget the person who is a victim. Criminal justice administration just do not pay attention to the victim's plight. Rather, they look at the victim as a witness at the most, because the state would represent in most of the matters. Now, if we go to the ancient India, it was well laid down. What we call as fact to be established was then referred as the sadhya. The means by which the fact was sought to be proved was called as praman, what we refer as evidence. And there were very strict laws when it came to what we call as the officers, the inspectors today. They were called as dandakari or the danda adhikari, but they were subject to several principles that they could not cross their limits. So when we talk about the criminal justice administration system, we talk about fairness of justice. But today, when it is just do it, well, though people may have different opinions about Manu, I'm not saying that what Manu said is correct or etc. But Manu becomes relevant here. Because he said, Dandaha Shasti Pradnya Sarva Danda Eva Bhirakshati Danda Sumteshu Jagarti Danda Dharma Vidurvada. Punishment remains awake when the people are asleep. So the wise have recognized punishment itself as a form of dharma. So today punishment has become the dharma. By what means you give it, you just give it. So forget about the fair trial. Forget about the administration of justice. Because we have had a session by Mr. KTS Tulsi wherein respect to bail as well. Bail was said to be the rule and jail was an exception. Now it is reversed. You also said the same point.
Correct. Absolutely.
Even where it was the right, it is just ignored. So we have an administration, but is it really a justice administration or an administration of justice? So that's where you are, absolutely. And the questions came in that direction only. Everyone nowadays, well, I like to say, and I always utter this, that the time has come, we should not look for regulation. We should work toward governance. People also have to understand their responsibilities. And if people fulfill that, I don't think so any other person who is part of the criminal justice administration would ever dare not do what he or she is required as per the rule of law. And that's what we have seen in series of cases and which has happened. There was interesting question with respect to the adultery and what is the role of that person who no more is that. But if we go to the basic understanding of the principle of adultery, many people have forgotten that that offense talk about woman as a property of the husband. Though the section does not mention it, but it had to do with the so-called logic or the reason so prevalent of the society then. How can woman be treated as a property? Because it is who will take the matter to the police always was the husband. And who the person, the other culprit is another male. So means, there are several things which we really need to look into. And I'm told that the present government, and I'm seeing that, would like to reform the criminal justice administration, several criminal laws which are happening. Let us hope that the things would happen. Even people celebrate the single judgment. People say that, oh, what a wonderful judgment, my freedom of speech and expression, everything is. But people have forgotten. Earlier, if you are defamed, like something is written about you, you could directly hold the intermediary liable and they had to take action within 24 hours. Now that has gone. You have to go to police or you have to go to the court, and in that the whole defamation will take place, and after a month you may get some order. So even people have to study the judgments that way. But people just celebrate one way, but they forget that we have given 99 away and we just got one. I think that justice just does not mean that I got what I wanted, but what I got, is it really worth for the society as well? And that's what you said, that one judgment was this, Dr. Madhukar said this judgment, and law is forgotten. This is my humble submission as a learner of law, which I have seen over the year. We celebrate judgments, but what those judgments mean to the society or to the generation later, that is the point of contention. So thank you very much for making the session, the criminal investigation and trial so interesting. Because I posed this question in the class, have you been ever to the police station? If there are 100 students present in the class, all 100 would look in a suspicious way. Why did you ask that question? So much is the faith they have in the criminal justice. So we say that no, as not as a visitor or a guest, have you been able to, so that you can realize. But you made it very clear and you related with the sections, etc. And thank you very much for such a delightful session. And I'm saying this from my experience, that it was one of the best session we have experienced, and that too on a Sunday. We could see the participant, the kind of questions and the unending questions. And the credit goes to the charm which you always carry, which is an inherent part of you. And you responded to all questions duly. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. The pleasure was all mine. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now I would just invite Mihir for the vote of thanks.
Yes, thanks, Raj. So I would like to first of all thank Anupam Lal Das sir, who's been like a teacher, a mentor, and elder brother to both me and Raj, for taking time out on a Sunday. And we know that we are delaying his lunch, but thankfully for this, thanks a lot for this enlightening lecture. I would also like to thank Raj for moderating today's session. I would like to thank our supporters and collaborators, Lex Witness, THS, the law firm, and Sadgamaya Group for supporting us in this endeavor. And lastly, I would like to thank our college and our teacher, Professor Dr. C.J. Ravandle, for giving us his guidance and allowing us to initiate and work on this knowledge series. Lastly, I would like to thank all the participants for attending today's session. If you want to revisit this session or you want to see the earlier sessions, the videos of all these sessions are available on the YouTube channel of our college. I would also like to request you to participate and register for next week's leave. Thanks a lot. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Professor Ravandle is seeking your permission to end the webinar now.
Yes, Mr. Akshay.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.